today's Mind Matters, our summer Minds Matters, is going to be recorded. So we are able to share all this really great information that Nicole has to share with us today and be able to spread it throughout the rest of the Central Texas community or anyone else who may be able to benefit from this information. So I really appreciate you all being here tonight. I hope you all have either dinner or some snacks or something to sip on because I know it is dinner time. And I appreciate you all also dedicating all of your time tonight to listen attentively to Nicole and what she has to share regarding the legal processes of housing and then also finding care and power of attorneys and everything that can come into play if you are a caregiver of someone with a serious mental illness. A couple different side things to remember throughout tonight is I'm just going to keep y'all on mute. If you have anything to say or if you have any questions for Nicole, please put it in the chat. I will be manning the chat while Nicole will be sharing her presentation today. So if you have any questions regarding what Nicole has, we can ask that at the end. If you have any other general questions, put it in the chat. We will leave time at the end for question and answers. A quick little plug about NAMI, if you are new here, is that NAMI stands for National Alliance on Mental Illness. So we have an affiliate here. Nicole Gillen, she goes around and she talks about mental health services to other NAMIs within the United States. So I'm very lucky we're able to snag her here tonight. The Mind Matters series that happens on a seasonal basis. So our next one will be in fall, and we're hoping to have it be a piggyback off of what Nicole is sharing with us today. So Nicole, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. You can go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we will go from there.
Awesome. Thank you, Anna. I really appreciate it. Hi, everybody. I am Nicole Gillen. I'm actually based in Virginia. And I am a caregiver. I have a 26-year-old daughter with schizophrenia. So I come to this conversation as somebody who's in the fight. She's been going through this for about 4.5 years. And while on some levels, she's much, much better, she still has a long way to go. So by no means is life easy breezy Louise. Life is still very, very difficult for her in particular, and for all the things I need to do to help her as a caregiver. So when she got diagnosed a couple years ago, and I was in this fight, and if any of you are caregivers or you're diagnosed and you're in this fight, because that's what it is, I was so appalled at the lack of resources for people like us who are on this call tonight. I was so stymied at the fact that the only way to find information was on calls like this. And if I missed a call, then what did I miss, right? And how did I understand what was what? And so I just started writing my own Google Doc one day of all the things that I thought I needed to know. And I was attending calls and this and that. What started as a paragraph became a 400-page book. So I'm going to use that as my sort of backdrop for today's conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So we'll use that as the way to talk through things. And today's content is actually from a boot camp that I put together, but I'm not going to go through the entire boot camp. I'm sort of cherry picking the concepts that I know you guys wanted to know more about. And so, as I said, I'm a mom, I'm a caregiver. I'm also an advocate. I'm part of an organization called the Angry Moms. I don't know if any of you are also angry and you want to know more about that. We could talk about that later. And that's the book that I wrote. And that's what I'll be referencing in today's conversation. And whatever, I've been all over the place. I'm in podcasts and I've been written up and all these things. So theoretically, I know what I'm talking about, but maybe not. So if I were to give the entire course of everything that's kind of maps to the book that I wrote, these are all the areas. So starting the far left, it would be talking about hospitals, case managers, treatments, doctors, all the sort of core medical stuff. I would talk about key management areas, what I call the human issues. How do you communicate with your loved one who's ill? How do you talk to family and friends? What kind of support groups, just like this, are the best fit for you. And then I move into crisis, things that can happen anytime in the third module. So whether it's suicidal ideation, arrests, runaway, jail, police, and obviously housing homelessness. So we're going to talk about housing and homelessness today. And then moving into module 4, I move into more what I call infrastructure stuff. So legal issues, financial issues, insurance issues. And then in module 5, I move into long-term things, estate planning, budgeting, etc. So the content in gray is all legal oriented. The content in light blue is housing and homelessness. So I understand that that's really the areas that you guys wanted me to focus on. So I will gleefully focus on that. Now, as I go through the content today, if you have a conversation in one of the other areas, I'm happy to try and help you out. I'm happy to try and see if we can answer it either on this call or if I need to go back and do research. Either way is fine. Because I know that this is always very fluid and frustrating. And what you thought you knew yesterday gets completely, moved in a different direction today. So I get it. So anyway, so that's the focus of today's conversation is the light blue on housing and homelessness, and then the gray on kind of legal issues. All right. So I always give this, and maybe this helps you from a talking points perspective and I've given this to a lot of mental health professionals. I'm just saying. And when I give this slide to them, it's like an aha moment. And what I say is like, look, as a therapist, as a psychologist, as an LCSW, as a psychiatrist, as a however, this is what they see. And they don't see our loved one before they ever got sick. They don't see the full picture of the loved one. But for all of us who are on this call who are a caregiver or a loved one or whatever, we, however, have all these questions about how we can best support our loved one who is quite sick with this illness. And while we're concerned about the medication and the treatment, there's a million other things that we have to figure out. And so as a caregiver, this is just like tip of the iceberg of what you need to worry about on a day-to-day basis. And on top of that, what makes it harder is that in the United States in particular, everything from healthcare and hospitals and doctors to legal issues to insurance and disability disability payments like SSI and SSDI, to jails and police, to housing and government support are different in every state. And so if you live in Texas and now you need to move to Nebraska, everything you thought you knew is no longer the same. And so this lack of consistency across our country means that, like everyone on this call, we need to figure it out on our own. All these core issues are different in every state, which makes it that much harder, that much more frustrating. And when you have a loved one who's already struggling with having stability, and yet all the key things that you have to navigate are different in every state, how do you do this? So we'll talk about that. But I want you guys all to know, and my assumption is most people who are on the call today are a caregiver of some sort, and that you do have a material impact. Everything from improving treatment outcomes to increasing the ability for your loved one to engage, to improving their overall life, to hopefully, right, through all these right steps and reducing your own stress and improving your own condition. So you do make a difference. And, I remember in college, I took an econ class. I'll never forget the professor said, day 1, if you remember nothing from this class, you will remember supply and demand. And here I am 400 years later, showing the same thing the professor showed us. And I show you that only to say, you do make a difference. And if you remember nothing else, I want you guys all to take that away. You're here because you're trying to make a difference. So look, I have information. I have a starting point for a lot of this stuff. But at the end of the day, your loved one's treatment path is their treatment path. And so I can't make specific recommendations for medications or hospitals or all sorts of things, but we can certainly talk about, ways to think about things as you try to help them. All right. So there's my big long preamble. I have no idea how I'm doing on time because I just realized I'm not wearing a watch. So I'm assuming I'm doing well. So I'm going to go ahead and just jump right into legal related issues. And I want to start with, if your loved one is incapacitated, and incapacitated is a broad spectrum. They could be incapacitated in the sense that they can live at home, but they can't take care of their medications. Or they can't live at home, but they can take care of their medications. Or they're in the hospital and you need to be dealing with doctors. Or they're not in the hospital and you need to talk to doctors and you need to help with their medication, right? It's just this weird wibbly wobbly spectrum of all the possible scenarios that might be happening with your loved one. And so there's always this question of, what's the right approach? Do I get conservatorship or guardianship, or do I go for power of attorney? So let me start with the sort of classical definitions of these things. And classically, conservatorship and guardianship are much more brother and sister, whereas power of attorney is like a distant cousin. So let's talk about conservatorship and guardianship. Conservatorship traditionally had much more of a financial focus. So think of your elderly parent, right? Where you need to have control over their assets to make sure that whatever, if other people have access to their accounts, if things are going sideways and you want to make sure that that money is protected, that's conservatorship. If it's more, like maybe they have dementia or Alzheimer's, or for our loved ones, schizophrenia or another serious mental illness, and you need to have absolute decision-making over all the things, not just financial, but doctors and decisions on medical health and decisions on housing and decisions on all sorts of things, where it basically is like it makes them a teenager all over again. So when you have guardianship, you have that level of authority over your loved one. And in some states, the caveat is that for them, conservatorship is guardianship. So it's not a definitive, oh, I must go for guardianship, because depending on, like, for example, the laws in Texas, which I'm not familiar with, it could be either. And I don't know the answer, but I want you to understand sort of where the intention of both of these started. They're in many states becoming kind of one instrument in the same, but the sort of driving reason why you need either is because of HIPAA. And we're going to talk about HIPAA in a little bit. But HIPAA is a curse word nightmare. Fill in the blank with whatever word you want. And if any of you have been through the runaround like I have in dealing with doctors and hospitals who are basically like, go away, lady. I want nothing to do with you. I don't care that you're trying to take care of your daughter. I don't care that you've got the best intentions. I don't care that you've got knowledge about her past. I don't care, that you have been talking to her therapist. I don't care that you know about all of her other medications. I'm not giving you squat. And it is mind-blowingly frustrating. So that's why so many people go after conservatorship or guardianship, because it means the doctor must talk to you because you've basically regained like parental rights over your loved one. There's also power of attorney. In some states, it's power of attorney. In some states, it's mental health power of attorney. And they're conceptually the same. It does not give you the same level of authority as conservatorship or guardianship. But what it does is it allows you to have those same conversations with the doctors. It allows doctors to, open the kimono and tell you everything that you need to know. It means that you can have access to all the portals. You can have access to all the information. You can have access to all the people that you need to talk to, no matter what. But it doesn't necessarily give you full capacity in terms of making all the decisions. And so depending on your loved one, depending on your situation, for my daughter, I was able to go with power of attorney. And thankfully, she was compliant enough and she was yielding enough that I did not have to go the conservatorship or guardianship route. No matter which one you go with, at the end of the day, it's all based on trust. Your loved one has to trust you. I don't know if any or all of you are familiar with LEAP, which is a methodology written by a man named Dr. Javier Amador. And Dr. Amador wrote a book called I'm Not Sick, I Don't Need Help. If you don't have it, get it. This whole LEAP process is all about partnering with your loved one. And it's all about kind of getting on side with them so they feel that you're on side with them. And in that process, making sure that your loved one feels that trust, because that trust is what's going to open the door for any one of these. Now, having said that, every situation is different. And sometimes your loved one is so lost in the positive symptoms. They're so overcome by what's happened to them that trust is not even relevant, right? They're not who they were. They're lost in the disease. And then what do you do? And that's when you leverage the fact that they are hopefully in a hospital to work with the hospital to move them into guardianship. And hospitals can help make it happen. They typically have what they call mental health courts in the hospital system, so that from that hospital, you can apply for guardianship and get that set up. So when they come out, everything is ready to go. And so unfortunately, depending on the severity of their symptoms and the severity of what's happened to them, you may need to leverage the hospital process to obtain either conservatorship or guardianship. And so, Anna, let me ask you a question. Should I stop and ask questions right now? What would you rather I do, or keep on?
Whatever you would like to do, whatever is most natural for you.
I'm fine with questions if anyone wants to jump in. I would rather hear their voices other than listen to me flap my gums all day.
Does anyone have any questions for Nicole? You can either unmute yourself, raise your hand, or go ahead and put it in the chat.
I had a quick question.
Go
Oh.
for it,
I was just curious. Do any of the therapists partner with you or work with you to kind of make sure that the right type of either power of attorneys, conservatorship, guardianship, do they help with any of that, or social workers assist you with that area?
So theoretically, social workers or case managers are supposed to. I mean, that's part of their job, is to facilitate this kind of stuff. I've never had help from any of them. And it has been astonishing. I had one caseworker when my daughter was hospitalized, and I had been talking to her on the phone, telling her that, okay, so, she's getting out Tuesday at 1 p.m. No problem. I'll be there. I promise you I'll be there. I will be there. Tuesday at 12:30, I show up at the hospital, let her know I'm there. I'm in the waiting room. 1 o'clock rolls around, 1:30 rolls around, 1:45. And I'm like, hey, where's my daughter? Yeah, well, guess what? She walked my daughter out to the curb and left her on the curb. My daughter had no cell phone. She had a prescription in her hand. She could have wandered off into the dark, and I would have, into the day, and I would have had no idea. So no, Jacqueline. Unfortunately, none of them have been helpful, much to my chagrin. So, but if your loved one's in the hospital, try to get them to help you. But that's why, if you can, find the person who's sympathetic, a nurse practitioner, a nurse, a case manager, a therapist, a doctor, the guy who opens the door if it's a locked facility, anybody who can help you, use it. Because they all know, they know the system, they know the things for that hospital, for how your state works, to help make it happen for you. It's just mind-blowing. If you go to if you go in Texas and you go online, start researching mental health courts in Texas. Find out how to access them. Find out, do you need to hire your own attorney, or can you do this through the hospital system so you don't have to hire an attorney? you know, those kinds of things. There are every state's a little bit different in all those kinds of details. Some states are going to mandate that you must have an attorney for your loved one, you must have an attorney for you, and the hospital must have an attorney. It becomes a giant rigmarole. I mean, that's what happened with my kiddo. And that's actually why I didn't go down the conservatorship or guardianship, because when I had to have her admitted once, you know, she had an attorney who represented her, and I almost leapt through the phone, and, you know, yeah, it was not a great experience. So anyhow, yeah, I don't know if that answered your question or not. But find everybody. Anybody else have a question before we move on? These are big, heavy topics. And, you know, I can go into lots and lots of depth of all the sort of minute differences. The reality is Texas is going to have a preference for conservatorship or guardianship. Then you need to make a decision as to which one you want to go for with your loved one based on their situation. All right, I'm going to keep on trucking if there's no other questions. Okay. All right, let's talk about advanced directives, and then we'll move more into HIPAA. So we'll kind of ignore the middle column. That's insurance. We're not talking about that today. But advanced directive, left-hand side. So advanced directive is when you are of sound mind and body, you can say, well, you know what, if I ever get sick, you know, if I'm brain dead, pull the plug. If I can't breathe on my own, pull the plug. If, right, all the ifs. And so if something, you know, God forbid ever happens to you, that people know how to support you in that case when you are incapacitated. Same thing applies here. A lot of states encourage people who are mentally ill to have an advance directive. I will tell all of you, they are a double-edged sword. And if someone's of sound mind and body today, and they're talking about, well, what happens if I have a relapse? And they say, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And those decisions they make now mean that when they do have a relapse, you're handcuffed, even if you have guardianship. So if anyone's pushing you or suggesting something like an advance directive for your loved one, tread lightly and carefully. There's different varieties. There's a psychiatric advance directive, standard advanced medical directive, advanced healthcare directive, and they all have like subtle differences between them in terms of what they address. Obviously, the psychiatric one is purely an advance directive for the noodle, as opposed to an advanced medical directive is more body oriented, and healthcare directive has to do, it's sort of noodle, but it also then brings in more of the therapeutic side of things. If you feel like you must do this for your loved one, or if they're pushing it, really try to get counsel on what might be the most appropriate advance directive for your loved one. And again, everyone's situation is so different based on what their symptomology has been, how long they've been in recovery, you know, how Texas deals with an advance directive should somebody have one. I mean, unfortunately, it ends up putting a really high wall around them of what can and can't be done if they get sick again. And on one hand, I completely appreciate why people would want them, right? I mean, I have an advance directive of sorts for myself for if I get sick when I'm hopefully much, much, much older. But I mean, this is a different beast. So I just cannot caution you enough on advance directives about not charging into something like that, because it sounds like it'd be a great idea, right? Yes, we'll give them agency over their own decisions. We'll give them the ability to, you know, sort of chart their own course. But this disease robs them of that understanding when they get sick. And it's just a reality. So we're going to put advance directives to the side. You now know how I feel. All right, HIPAA. So I don't know if any else here on this call, and I'm assuming if you could raise your hand, you probably are, have had issues with HIPAA. We all know so many reasons why it's problematic. You know, if our loved ones had Alzheimer's, doctors would talk to us all day long. They would tell us how they're doing, what medications they're taking, what the therapeutic approach is going to be, what problems they see. Blah, 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 blah. The doctors would be a big open book and we would know everything. But for some reason, because it's this little thing called schizophrenia or bipolar or schizoaffective, all of a sudden doctors think that we are the pariah for wanting to know what's going on, for helping. And they use HIPAA as a shield. It's actually called HIPAA handcuffs. That's the big word that everybody, or big expression that everybody uses. So what do? Well, assuming you don't have guardianship, conservatorship, or power of attorney, then what? Are you completely out of luck? The answer is no. So it's not as great, but you're going to start with creative communication. You're going to start with, I talk a lot in my book about creating like a one-page summary that you fax to the hospital. You don't bring it in, you don't mail it to them, you fax it to them. That's the way they work. You fax it to them and it ends up in their file. You then create an extended, kind of playbook in a way. And that playbook takes time to create, but please do it. You create that playbook and it has everything. Like for 3 years, every week, I had updates to the playbook of my daughter where I talked about what medications were working, what challenges she was having, what I was seeing about her symptoms, blah, 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 blah. Every week I wrote it down. So when I gave the doctors a 5-page summary of everything that had happened month over month over month over month over month over month, I all of a sudden was like, oh, there's some gravitas there. There's some engaged caregiving going on. But they need the 1-page summary. Doctors need the, right? Like boom, 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 medications, boom, 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 hospitals, boom, 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 doctors, boom, 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 timeline, boom, 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 right? Like they need that. Because while the long narrative document can be exceedingly helpful in making your case about why they need to talk to you, that 1 page is the thing they're going to clue in on. Because they're going to go, oh, I'm going to put her back on olanzapine. Oh, I'm going to put her on paliperidone. Oh, you're like, see the 1 page? See that she's already tried that? See that it didn't work at all? So you need to make sure they have all the information, everything. You start to call and you're talking to the nurse on call, you're talking to the nurse practitioner, you're talking to various people. Hey, did you get my this? Hey, what time is Dr. So-and-so going to come in? Okay, should I, when Dr. So-and-so comes in, I've got this other piece of information. Should I fax that to you now? Or should I wait till they come in and do it at that time? Doesn't matter. You start to do everything you can to chew around the edges of giving them information so that they feel like they can in fact come back to you to talk. When they come back to you to talk, they are likely not going to want to talk. So instead, what you do is you give them scenarios. So let's just say this is not my daughter. Let's just say this is Susie off the street who has the following symptoms, like my daughter, who's been on the following medication, like my daughter. But we're not talking about my daughter. We're talking about this mythological human being called Susie. So if you were going to treat Susie, what would you do? If I was going to help Susie at home, what should I do? So you literally make up stories with them on the phone where they can talk about Susie and what they would do for Susie and give advice relative to this made up human being called Susie so that you can apply it to your loved one. It's ridiculous, but it was the only thing that worked for me for 2 years until I got power of attorney. And then obviously trying to move to one of these instruments based on your loved ones so that you have an ability to actually work around HIPAA. Now, I'm part of a group and we are going after HIPAA, particularly in this space, because the only reason HIPAA, unfortunately, really exists in the world of serious mental illness is not to protect our loved one, but it's to protect the doctors, the hospital, and the insurance company. Those are the only people who are protected with HIPAA. So we're looking for ways to see how we can amend it, but it's a reality. All right, I've talked through another slide. I'm going to go ahead and pause. Come on, kids. Somebody give me a question. Come on. Are we all that quiet?
If anyone happens to think of questions, maybe as you're processing this information and maybe something doesn't come to mind right off the top of your head, you can always send it to me as well, the same email that I reached out to you with, and then I can always forward it to Nicole as well. Highly encourage asking questions because she is a wealth of knowledge, but if something were to pop up later, please know that's also an option as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Anna. That's right. And so, these are the big legal topics in this world of SMI. And I touch on other legal aspects in the book. Like, so for example, I talk about how to find low cost or pro bono attorneys. I talk about, well, I'm going to get to special needs trust here in a second. I go a lot more in depth into HIPAA. And for a call like this, I don't know to the degree you guys want me to go like seriously in depth on HIPAA. I've got my book right here, so I'm looking at it. But these are the things that you're going to want to be armed with as you move forward in terms of providing the best support for your loved one. So let's now move to estate planning, trusts, and letter of intent. So the reality is, unfortunately, they haven't figured out how we can live forever. Not that I know I want to, because apparently aging is a little more brutal than I expected. But as we age in our caregiver roles, we need to make sure that our loved one is going to be taken care of. And it doesn't matter whether or not we have money to give them. What matters is that there's a net under them. And that net stays in place long after we pass. And so, if I go down the left-hand side and we start talking about general planning, having a life insurance policy, not a bad thing. And again, you don't have to have millions of dollars in the bank. It's irrelevant. But if you have some sort of life insurance policy so that when you pass, some money could go to them. Because as we all know, disability, not enough to live on anywhere in this country. And so making sure, again, they have that net. Meeting with someone to do financial planning. And again, it's not like you have to have a lot of money in savings. This is about making sure that you have thought through how to best set them up for success in the future. Whether you're going to be able to leave them money or not, irrelevant. What's more important is thinking through a financial plan for them so that you have peace of mind. Having a healthcare proxy, somebody that's not you, that you can name so that, again, when you pass, there is somebody who can now take over working with your loved one. Special needs trust. And I'll talk about that in a second because that entire middle column is about special needs trust. So we'll put a pin in that. The will and estate plan. Having a will, having a comprehensive estate plan will be critical. That estate plan that talks about, what are the priorities for your loved one? How do the courts, how does the state, how does the rest of your family, how does everybody and anybody need to engage with your loved one after you pass? Building a letter of intent. That's another one I'm going to put a pin on because that's the entire right-hand column. We talked about power of attorney. We talked about guardianship and having those in place, but then also naming, why is the word not sequence, but naming the person who would pick up the ball after you pass. Making sure that your loved one is on either SSDI or SSI or both. So they've got that income. One is the disability income. One is Social Security insurance. And we can have a whole separate conversation about both of them. But fundamentally, they are the avenues to make sure your loved one has some kind of, quote, income coming in. Making sure you got long-term planning set up for yourself and your loved one, because God forbid you get incapacitated. and then you're not able to manage all this stuff. So making sure you've got a backstop for yourself as you get older, and then obviously having beneficiary designations. And, you're looking at this list and you've got to be thinking to yourself, holy smokes, this is a lot of work. And it is a lot of work. None of this is a light lift, but these are all the things. And if you do this, and what I often advise people is chip away at it, right? Every quarter, do one thing. So this quarter, in the course of 3 months, set up life insurance. And then the next 3 months, do the financial planning. And in the next 3 months, don't eat this elephant in one bite, but absolutely do it. Because you're here on a call like this, on an evening, on a Tuesday night, because it's important to you. And these are the things that you need to do. So let's move on to special needs trust. So a special needs trust is a special vehicle to ensure that any money that needs to be distributed to your loved one upon your passing is managed. So imagine you've got $5 million, woo, in your bank account. I don't want to be your friend, but let's just say you have $5 million and you die and you've got no trust set up. What that means is all that money goes to your loved one because there's no one to manage it. There's no one to say, hold on, let's make sure they have $3,000 a month in perpetuity, or let's make sure they have $5,000 a month in perpetuity, whatever it is. Somebody who makes sure, what are they spending that money on? Are they spending on meds, or are they going to Vegas and gambling? What are they doing? Are they making good decisions with this money? And, these are examples of some of the special needs trusts that are out there and the kinds of organizations that help manage it. There are some organizations, like we see the third bullet down, that do a pooled special needs trust. And so they take money from lots and lots of people and they smash it all together. And then, your money is part of that, kind of like in a little bubble inside the big bubble. So they know what gets dispensed to your loved one, but they pool all the money, they pool how it's managed, and they get lift as a result by doing that. There's pros and cons in terms of the fees you pay versus the benefits your loved one gets versus doing a more traditional third-party special needs trust. You hire a bank, as an example, and the bank is the organization that manages this process. Their fees are super high, but the service is often a little more, a little better, because they are really vigorous about managing that money. So lots of options on how to set up a special needs trust to manage your money when you die, based on what you've done in terms of the general planning on the far left-hand side of the screen. And then the last thing I want to mention is letter of intent. Letter of intent is, kind of goes hand in hand with a will, with an estate plan, with the trust. And what the letter of intent is again, not a small document, not a small lift, but it's everything. It is everything in the kitchen sink. So where does your loved one live? Do they own it? Are they renting? Is it government housing, subsidized? Do you pay for it? Who pays for it? What's the living situation? Do they have an ACT team? Do they have a team that sort of is doing coordinated care for your loved one? If so, who are the key players? How does it work? What would someone need to know? What's all the legal info? Guardianship, conservatorship, power of attorney, advance directive, will information, special needs trust information, estate plan, all the legal stuff. Who are trustees? Who are the people who can manage and monitor all of this? Where's stuff stored? Do you have a storage facility, or do you have your own apartment, or do they have stuff? Like, where do you need to know where things might be that your loved one might need access to? Who's the rest of the family? What roles might they play? what's the financial landscape of this individual, so that anyone who's involved in monitoring this and reading this and managing this knows what they need to look at. Do they have prior criminal information? Why would that be important? Well, that's important because if they have, unfortunately, a rap sheet of sorts, and you're not there with that case history, so God forbid something happens after you pass, and now all of a sudden the judge is looking at them as if it's a first time. And the judge goes to hit that gavel, but they don't understand, wait, they've been in mental health court before. Wait, they've had, they spent time in jail, but here's what happened, and blah, 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 blah. If they don't know any of that, then they might get a bad sentence. So these things all work together to ensure that there's the strongest net possible for your loved one after you pass. And, there are a lot of options for all of these things. There's a lot of options for how do you create a will, an estate plan. There's a lot of options for life insurance, for special needs trust, for all these things. It's just, your eyes can roll back in your head. There's so many options. But please explore them. Please figure out what is the best path for you and for your loved one. Because if you don't, and you pass, all bets are off. And I mean, all bets are off. I mean, in a way, this is probably the most important slide I would show. The other ones are great. You need guardianship, conservatorship, power of attorney. Yeah, absolutely. You need to understand these concepts, but this is some of the most important planning you could do legally. All right, now you gotta have questions this time. Come on, you guys. Susan, woo!
Hi, thank you. Thank you for joining us for this meeting or hosting this for us. I wanted to know the letter of intent that you're going to be putting all of that information in. Is that something that needs to be done through an attorney? Does it need to be notarized? Is it just like, how would that information get where it needs to go if something were to happen?
That's a great question. It does not have to be notarized or any of that kind of stuff. It is literally just like a Word document or Google Doc, whatever, however you want to do it, that hits all these key points. And then you take it and then you just put it with your will documents. It becomes like an addendum to your will. And so that way, when an attorney is reading the will, they pull this out as the letter of intent. So there's usually in the will, there's a comment about, and please refer to the letter of intent for, how to, whatever, how to work with the ACT team, or how the family should be involved, or those kinds of things. And that comes down to how you want to stipulate it, whatever the most important things are. So for example, in my family, I would not want my brother involved in helping my daughter for a lot of reasons. And so I would specifically state in the will how I'd want that to happen. And point them to the letter of intent, which then talks about who I would want involved in helping my daughter if I'm not here. So the letter of intent is just like a regular Word document, but it gets referenced in these other legal documents.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you for explaining that.
Yeah, of course. Yep.
It's like a narrative, correct, Nicole?
Yes, that's exactly right. Yep.
That's how it is in business. So I was curious. Another question on my end is more about like access to pro bono attorneys to help with this kind of work. How easy is that for folks, or is that really kind of word of mouth?
No, I have, see if I can find it real fast. In my book, I have a list of, it's everything from, sometimes depending on where you live, there might be legal aid clinics. There might be some local nonprofits. Sometimes through disability benefits, you can find attorneys. I'm trying to think what else. I have a whole laundry list of attorneys in here of how to find pro bono type attorneys, or at least, greatly reduced cost attorneys. Because not all of us can afford, big $350 an hour attorneys. who, by the way, don't even understand this space to begin with. And that's a whole nother thing altogether. Most attorneys are completely clueless when it comes to serious mental illness and how to write the language appropriately. And so, going through like these legal aid clinics and things like this are sometimes the best avenues because they see more of SMI than the big high-priced $350 an hour attorneys. So, yeah.
That was going to be what my kind of follow-up question. Just, I'm sure not all attorneys are familiar working in this particular space and kind of navigating that and finding those who do, or if you don't have that choice, potentially, like, especially here in Texas, there's such a lack for mental health resources. I don't know if that was something you kind of just, you do the best you can with the attorney that you can find. And
So I found the page here. So legal aid organization, some pro bono attorneys. You can contact local bar associations and or legal clinics, and they might be able to refer you. Some nonprofit organizations. There might be some community-based. Sometimes they do workshops and seminars to help you actually build out some of these documents. Sometimes government agencies will have resources that you can use. Law school clinics, that's another area to pursue because a lot of times that's a way for them as like a proving ground to help build this kind of stuff. There are some attorneys that do limited scope representation that will again give you a reduced fee to help you on some of this. And then obviously, some of these things you can find templates online, but it's never quite right because this is such an unusual space. So I would not necessarily recommend that, but those are some good options that I just sort of quickly rattled off in terms of trying to find something that might be in Texas. Okay. All right, let's move into housing and homelessness. Two very difficult situations to talk about. So let's start with housing. So in many states, there are a number of programs that exist to provide support within the home. Respite services, in-home counseling services, in-home like monitoring, somebody who can come and actually monitor your loved one, make sure they take their medication, help them with job searching, help them with all sorts of things. There are lots of in-home potential services. So if your loved one lives with you, something to look into. As part of home health services, it sort of expands it. That's where you get into, as I mentioned, like the medication management. It could be somebody who does in-home training to help your loved one sort of rebuild some skills, or you help them play certain like brain games and things like that. Help them start to think through strategies for life and for all sorts of stuff. So, support services within the home, respite services, these advisory kind of counseling services. There's establishing housing readiness. I want to talk about that. So what is housing readiness? So housing readiness is assuming your loved one lives with you, and they're saying, I'm ready to live on my own. And you're thinking, oh my God, you're not ready to live on your own. But you don't necessarily have a definitive, like, a way to approach the conversation. And so in my book, I talk about things like probably like 15 different areas of how to explore that conversation. Everything from, we'll start with medication management. Well, sweetheart, or so-and-so, I still manage your meds. Until you can prove to me that you can manage your meds for 3 months, I'm not confident. Are you able to manage the pharmacy? Yes or no? Are you able to manage your doctor's appointments? Yes or no? Are you able to manage your therapy? Are you able to do your laundry every week? Are you maintaining social friendships? Are you working part-time, full-time? And there's a whole laundry list of things. to establish housing readiness for your loved one. And I found it really helpful for my kiddo when there was a point where she was adamant, she was ready to get on out there. I was like, well, I pulled up the scroll of the 20 things that I outlined. And then she was like, oh, yeah, maybe I'm not quite ready. And so, but it's not just about medication. It's not just about doctors. It is truly the life stuff of life, right? Grocery shopping, errands, working a full day and then doing something like this, working a full day and then doing laundry, working a full day and then dealing with medication, working a full day and feeling terrible, working a full day, all of this stuff. These things that if you're neurotypical might still be hard and might still tax you and think, I don't want to do this, but we can do it. But now if you're not neurotypical, can you do it? And that's the rub. Shelters. Obviously, that is a, housing first program. Sorry, I skipped that completely. There are housing first programs across the country. And these are gaining a lot of traction as a longer term way of housing your loved one. And the whole sort of program behind Housing First is, get them in housing and make sure there's a plan for long-term housing. So, unfortunately, there's not a lot of programs like it, and not every state has it. And that's the other thing. Remember how I said at the very beginning when I was introducing that so many of these concepts are different in every single state? Well, all these things on the left-hand side are all different in every single state. So for example, Texas may not have housing first programs. Virginia does not. But it doesn't hurt to know about them, so you can ask about it. And if you ever move to another state, these are things to ask about in your state. Shelters, we obviously know those. Interestingly enough, there is a concept of a professional interventionist. I love this. And this is somebody who, and again, depending on your state, can be in your state that can advocate on behalf of your loved one if they're in a shelter. And they can make sure your loved one is in a safe place and getting the kind of support that they need. Doesn't exist everywhere, but they do exist. There's rapid rehousing, there's rent vouchers, there's scatter site housing, none of which are optimal. It's going to say. But sometimes they're the only option. What I have in my book is I talk about all the different kinds of housing options that exist in this country, from sort of getting to the page here, and it's mind-blowing. It's mind-blowing to me because it's awful, right? So whether there's government operated housing programs, so there's supportive housing programs and group homes. And we know about so many of the horror stories. I'm sure we've all had it, but it's government run, which means if your loved one's on Medicaid, it won't cost money. There's insurance covered options. So sometimes there's actually assisted living facilities. There's psychiatric residential treatment facilities, which often can end up being sort of medium term, I'll call it. There are additional government funded housing. So there's HUD subsidized housing, public housing, Section 8 housing, again, not great. Obviously, homeless shelters and services, housing first programs, which is talked about, foster care, which hopefully is not relevant here for most of the people who are on this call. And then, of course, there's out of pocket, right? Independent living apartments, there's transitional housing, there's shared housing, right? Where your loved one has a roommate. There's your own home. There are supported living arrangements, and then board and care homes. So there's a lot of options out there. The question is what's going to be the right one for your loved one? There's financial considerations. There's how close you need them to be to you. There's whether they're ready for something independent where they need constant supervision. Do they need someone to help them with their meds? Are they going to be too isolated if they're on their own, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all these kinds of things need to go into your understanding of the kind of housing options that you're going to, search for your loved one. And then there's homelessness, which is just another unfortunately terrible thing that happens here much more frequently than in other countries, particularly for this vulnerable population. So when we start talking about homelessness, what happens to somebody who has SMI when they're homeless? We all know food is so important to helping with recovery, obviously medication. And if they're not eating great food and they're not medicated, and there's a result potentially having bad decisions that might lead them in jail, bad decisions that might mean they get injured by other people on the streets, bad decisions in terms of where they end up. They're cold because it's really cold outside, or they're hot because they're sleeping on a hot street and they get sick as a result. We all know this impact is just hideous. And so from a caregiver's perspective, what do you do? Have they just run away? Or is this an ongoing problem? And if it's an ongoing problem, how do you get them off that street and get them into treatment? And, the reality is with homelessness, the next usually best step is not into housing, but into treatment, right? They got to get on medication. They've got to get stable before you can even consider housing. And so, as we know, there are hundreds of thousands of people in the United States, maybe more, who are either homeless or in jails that have serious mental illness. And unfortunately, the system lost them. And despite the best efforts of caregivers and family and all sorts of things, the system failed these people. And it is the system. And I don't know if any one of you have had somebody who's homeless or have run away, but at the end of the day, it's the system that failed them. And so having strategies in place so that if your loved one does run away or if they are homeless, for how you can help them, right? How you can give them a burner phone where your phone number is always plugged into it. How you can give them a medical bracelet where the medical bracelet has maybe your hometown doctor, or maybe has your name and a Google phone number, not your regular phone number. Because if they end up on the street and somebody looks at that phone number and says, oh, that's Aunt Susie's information, I'm going to call her and try to get money from her, or I'm going to look her up, or I'm going to do this, that other thing, like, so that you have some measure of anonymity, but a way for them to call you. That you have strategies in terms of everything from doctors and medication and hospitals and everything, that you have almost like a prearranged plan. So the minute you can get your hands on your loved one, that you can move them forward in that plan. A lot of this legal, housing, all of it is all about trying to be, to the degree that you can, one step ahead. So that no matter the situation, you've sort of already thought through that, oh, okay, if they are homeless, what am I doing with the police? If they are homeless, what am I doing with how they're clothed, or anything, right? That you've started to think about that, because you're going to know from your loved one based on, a prior reactions to the stuff, where they might likely end up or how they might likely end up. There's all sorts of things to do if they've run away in terms of creating flyers and how you engage with local authorities, and how you deal with online and social media type stuff to try and find them, to bring them back. Lots of strategies around that. But just know that when you're dealing with the homeless situation, if any of you have had to go that route, just it's not you, it's not them, it's the system. It's the system where we don't have enough beds. We don't have enough doctors who understand this illness. We don't have enough sympathy for our loved one who's no longer our loved one, at least before the disease, right? And the system loses them. And if you can do little tiny things to help sort of set your own net in that situation, then there are ways. I've mentioned earlier in the conversation about having Dr. Amador's book, I'm Not Sick, I Don't Need Help. And this is another one of those situations where I would say, have that book, read it, reread it, practice. Oh my God, I practiced with friends. I practiced with all sorts of people, the LEAP protocol, because it's so hard. And when your loved one is saying things that unfortunately make no sense because they're not in the right mind, and yet you're somehow trying to engage with them, you're somehow trying to get aligned on things. This book is really, really helpful with that. So say your loved one's on the street and all you're trying to do is to get them to walk into a hospital for a bed. That you use this to talk about aligned strategies. You use this LEAP protocol to agree on something that is important to them, which is a good night of sleep. And from there, if you can get them into the hospital and they can get a bed, you can maybe then swarm the hospital with everything, with all the other documents that we've talked about, with that one-page summary, with that multi-page document, with, with your guardianship, your conservatorship, your power of attorney. You can swarm that hospital to give them the help that they need. But it started with aligning with them on those goals and those priorities. And even if it's just for that one night, in their mind, it's just have a good night of sleep that one night. So I will go ahead and pause because I know that when particularly homelessness can be just a hard issue to talk about. But questions or comments?
I think it's a very hard topic to talk about, and it's always a discussion that myself or Nicole are open to having. I do want to be mindful of everyone's time since it is 7:35. If anyone would love to hang on and ask either a couple more questions for Nicole or maybe talk about a few other topics that she is an expert in, feel free to do so. If not, since I do know that it is 7:30, I appreciate you so much for dedicating some of your time tonight and talking about mental health, especially the role of being a caregiver of someone who lives with a serious mental illness. And as a follow-up, I will also be sending out Nicole's the link to Nicole's book. So since she wasn't able to cover everything today, it is all done within her book as well.
Awesome.
Any questions for Nicole?
Well, hi, it's Marilyn, and I just want to say that here in Texas, we don't have enough options on housing. The situation that we have is that we a lot of people in the state hospitals who cannot be discharged because there's not an appropriate place to discharge them to, because they need a very high level of support. They probably have anosognosia, which means they can't see or understand their illness. And as a result, when they go out of the hospital, they're just going to go off their meds or whatever and be back in the cycle again. So we are trying to get a very high level step down from the state hospitals in order to discharge these people. And have you any solution to that in any states?
No, sadly I don't. And I mean, I laugh, but it's horrible, right? It's criminal. And that's why so many people end up homeless and or in jails, right? Because they're homeless and then they do something because they're not on their meds and they end up in jail. And it's just this revolving bad door. And it's because we don't have the right housing. It's because we don't have the right system to keep them in the hospital long enough so they're truly no longer in psychosis. I can't tell you the number of times hospitals released my daughter and she was still in psychosis. And I'm like, are you kidding me? She's and thankfully I have a place for her and she can stay with me and she was never terrible in terms of of what her hallucinations and delusions did in her mind and how she reacted, but not everybody has that option. And so it is a incredibly sad, incredibly difficult, doesn't cover it, position that we all end up in.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's where we are in Texas. We're trying hard to get something that has a high level of support, a higher level of support than what we currently have.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's hard, it takes funding. And of course, that
That's-
takes the legislature. And so, anyway, thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, after look into housing first programs. There are a number of them across the country that are doing quite well.
We have those in Texas.
Oh,
Yeah,
are
we
they
have those in
not?
Texas, but the support is not at the level
Oh.
that I'm talking about.
Okay. Fair.
Yeah. I
I'm
mean,
gonna stop
it's not just making sure that somebody takes medication